Welcome to Coding with Tom. Today we're going to be creating a list inside of a UI collection view. So we're going to be showing the new Diffable DataSource that Apple released since iOS 13 and enhanced with iOS 14 release. We're going to be configuring a list inside of the first section of our UI collection view that has nested items inside. We will also be adding a swipe gesture to the nested items. Let's begin by creating the project. It will be a new application where we will be displaying the restaurants, and we will be using Storyboard and UIKit for this one. For this one, we're not going to be using mock data, or we're going to be hard coding the values that we're going to have. We're actually going to be fetching the information from a mock server. So in the folder of the project, we're going to have this restaurant API. Let's open it with Visual Studio Code and run npm start. Now let's open Safari and see what we have. So this is going to be our restaurants API. When we fetch it, we're going to get the category, and inside the category, for example, the first one, dining, we're going to have an array of restaurants per category, and we're going to be displaying these categories and restaurants in our app. Let's start with the model. Okay, so this is going to be our model. We're going to have category, which has an array of restaurants. Each restaurant will have a name, a description, and an image name. Then each restaurant has an array of rankings, which just has a score and comment. This part, we're going to leave it for future lessons. Now that we have everything, we're missing fetching the data. So instead of just hard coding it, we still need to create a service, but in the service, we're going to be using URL request and URL session to fetch this data from our local host in this case. So this is how you fetch data from a get endpoint. You just need to declare a URL with the, well, just with the string. And then from the URL shared session, you just create a data task with the URL request. And then here's a completion handler where you get the data back. Here you will get the response if you want to deal with the status code of the HTTP response. And then you have an optional error. For now, we're not going to be dealing with this. We're just going to be assuming we're always going to get a successful response with the data. And most importantly, after you create the task, you need to resume it. If you don't call this, nothing will happen. The task won't get executed, and well, yeah, nothing will be called. Right now, if we were to run this, nothing will happen because we'll get an exception, especially because HTTP is no longer allowed in iOS. We need to include an exception in our info plist to allow this localhost URL to be passed. For this, we're not going to be adding a new entry, which is app transport security settings. This is a dictionary, and inside that, and inside we're going to be allowing arbitrary loads. Yes. Now keep in mind this is just for testing. Now, here we are ready to parse the data, but notice data here is of type data. This is not a category or an array of categories. How can we manage that? If we go to our categories here, our struct, we can make it conform to the decodable protocol. This will make it so that with a JSON decoder, we can transform data into category. Now notice that I'm getting an error here where it says that category doesn't conform to the protocol decodable, and that's because one of its types, restaurant, is not decodable, string is. Now for restaurant, we need to apply the same. And I'm gonna get an error also because ranking is not decodable. So let's make ranking decodable. And now because category, restaurant, and ranking are decodable, we can take this data and decode it. So after you have the data, you just have to decode it. Now keep in mind that I'm not decoding category because we're receiving an array of categories. So we need to just pass. The type is an array of categories. Now let's add this to our view controller and view.load just to test. Let's just put the count. We should be receiving 4 categories. A small naming error here. It's not ranking, it's rating. Also, the restaurant will come with the restaurant ID. Oh, yeah, and this comes with an image name, icon image name. And there we have the print. We got 4 categories back. Now let's start creating our cells. So we have some predetermined image that our server is going to be sending. We're not going to be downloading images this time, but it's going to send us one of these names, and we're going to be displaying that image for that restaurant. For the categories, it's going to be an icon image name as in an FS symbol. Now let's go to our storyboard and add our controllers. Okay, now that we have our outlet set up, I'm gonna configure the collection view with a different method as we have done before. I'm gonna be using, instead of the UI collection view delegate, I'm gonna be using a UI compositional layout. In this case, it's gonna be a list. And instead of using UICollectionViewDataSource, I'm going to be using a Diffable DataSource. This has been since iOS 13, but in iOS 14, a lot of enhancements when added, and that's how we're going to be configuring everything here. If you want to delve deeper and more into detail about diffable data sources and modern cell configuration, I suggest you look at the WWDC 20 videos that Apple published. I'm going to add a link in the video description to that. Also, the code that the sample project that Apple publishes was used as a reference to build this video. Okay, so for the layout, we're using compositional layout, which we had already used. And for the only section that we're going to have for this lesson, we're going to be using a list configuration. Unlike the other sections that we have been configuring, a list section only needs a list configuration, which has an appearance, and then it leads the layout environment, which is passed in the section provider closure. So nothing very new here, just this new list configuration. Now let's move on to configure the data source. I also created this section and item because for a data source you need to specify the class you're going to be using for the section, the type, which is going to be a enum section, and the item, which is going to also be an enum. Both of them need to be hashable. So in our case, again, we're just going to have one section, and we're going to have two items, the category and the restaurant. So let's start first with the category. This is one of the new things we have right now, which is cell registration. So I don't need to register the cell with the collection view. This does it for us. So we create a cell registration and we specify the type of the cell that we're going to use. In this case, a default UICollectionView list cell, and the item which we're going to use to configure it. In this case, the category view model. We're going to get the category view model from our item, which has inside the category view model. This one needs to be hashable as well. We're going to be assuming that the combination of name and system icon is going to be unique for each one of them. Now with the cell registration, we can configure our data source. And also for now, let's not use the restaurant. And this is how we dequeue reusable cells. So we're going to be using the cell registration. We pass in the index path that we get from the provider, and we pass our category view model, which came with the item. And that's it for our data source. So for this, I'm not going to be creating a view model for this one. What I'm going to do right now is use directly the restaurant service adapter, and we'll have dependency injection in a later lesson where we're actually going to be doing actions with this. I know that we could be applying every single category here with a map, but you're going to see later why I'm adding them one by one with this array. So here what I'm doing is creating a Diffable DataSource section snapshot, keeping in mind that I'm adding a snapshot per section, even though this time we have just one section, but it doesn't matter. And then we apply the snapshot to our data source in that section. So I'm adding to the first one. Now here, I cannot adjust the view model. Remember that it's an item. Okay, let's try running. Here we have our categories: dining, lunch, desserts, and brunch. Now, if you see the data source where we do have those categories, now we need to be displaying the restaurants that are inside each of the categories. So we're going to make each of these items have other items nested. It's not going to be that each category is going to be a section. It is just that each one of these items is going to have other items inside. And these items are going to be restaurants. Now let's also create a struct for this one. And for this one, we are going to be creating a custom cell. So we need to first create a cell registration, but first let's create the cell. Okay, so again, as you saw, we used a content configuration. I actually don't know if, I went over this. So this is a new way of how we configure cells, again, in iOS 14, which is the UI list content configuration. Don't be fooled. This is not just for UI collection view list cell. This is actually for every cell in UI collection view, UI table view. And you can even apply this to your own custom views with some modifications. But it's basically what we have done before, where we pass a view model and let the outlets be configured privately inside of the cell. Well, now Apple's default implementation has it with this content configuration. So for our custom cells, we're going to do something similar that you're going to see in Apple sample project, which is adding our custom keys to the state of the cell so that we can then configure the view when it updates with the configuration. We're not going to be doing it manually. We're going to be setting the views by code. I'm just creating two labels, one for the name of the restaurant, the other one for the description of the restaurant. I'm going to have both of them in a stack view. And then I'm also going to have an image view. I'm going to arrange them horizontally in another stack view with some spacing. And that's pretty much it. The stack is going to have 100 points of height. I don't want the image to be that big for the restaurant. And also the image view will have an aspect ratio of 1:1. Now let's get on with the state. So what we're going to do is add an additional custom key to our state. So we're going to be adding a restaurant view model here. So for that, we need to extend UI configuration state custom key. And we're going to add a new variable. Then our configuration state needs to have this key. Now here we're going to do another trick where, well, our cell is ready to receive this, but in order to assign the view model, our class will have to have a reference, and that will be the purpose of actually configuring everything with the state. So for that, we're going to be creating another class. Let's also add an update method. And since we updated the view model, we need to update that state. For that, we need call set needs update configuration. And the only thing that we need to apply here is the method update configuration. Here in the state, we're going to be getting our view model. And that's it for our custom cell. Now, let's create another registration for it. And in our snapshot, we still add the category item, and then we add more items. Now let's also add an extension here for our restaurant. Now we're going to be using this where we add items to another item. So that other item is going to be the category item. And here we're going to be adding the restaurants. Let's try running with this. So you see that we are still seeing nothing. If I select here, nothing happens. Let's add our disclosure here, which is just an outline disclosure so that when I tap on it, I'm going to expand the cell. Now you see here we have this, and here we have our restaurant cells with the image view is not populating. Maybe I got the names wrong. Let's see. Okay, we had configured wrong that view model there. Let's expand it, and here we have our images. Now that we have our list, let's try adding a swipe action so that we can rate the restaurant. We're not going to be performing anything, we're just going to be adding the swipe so that we swipe one of the restaurants, not the categories, we can rate that restaurant. So if we get a restaurant item, where this is equals, sorry. So if we get a restaurant item, we're going to be doing something. If not, then we're going to be returning nil. Actually, let's name this item, since the item identifier is just going to be an item. We still don't know if it's a category or if it's a restaurant. Now that we have the item, let's create a method that will return a UI swipe action configuration for each item. Okay, so this is what we're doing. If we find a restaurant title, then we will configure the rate action, which is a UI contextual action. We pass in this style, the title, and then we just perform whatever code we have, and then we call the completion handler with true. We also can modify the background color and the image, in this case a star field, and then we just return those actions. We add that to our configuration, to our list configuration, and that's it. Let's run with it. When I'm swiping here, so you see if I swipe from left to right with the rate, if I click on it, rated restaurant. If I swipe again, you can also get the, when you swipe even more, then you get that action executed immediately. And that was all for today. Hope you enjoyed it. As you can see, we don't have to now use UICollectionViewDelegate and UICollectionViewDataSource. We can use a compositional layout and diffable data sources to configure and populate our collection views. This is pretty handy, and without having to use a table view, we have a list which didn't require much effort inside of a collection view. Hope you liked it. See you next time. Bye.